Great. Let's get going. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sebastian Karcher, and this is Effective Data Management in Online Research. The event is co-sponsored by the Center for Qualitative Multi-Method Inquiry and by the Moynihan Institute. And I have Yuri and Morgan from CQMI and Moynihan, respectively, here to help me. So thanks for that. Let me start with some logistics. We will be recording this event, and we'll likely post the video online. So just that you are aware, and if you're uncomfortable with that, maybe turn off your camera. During my talk, I'll try to talk for about 50 minutes, with 10 to 15 minutes of time for questions at the end. But I'm also very happy to take questions during the talk. Just put them in the chat, and Morgan will help me monitor that and then ask them when there is a good time. The slides will be shared, so I think we'll just send them to the entire participant list. So anyone who has registered will get a copy of the slides. And I think we've done this for a year now, alas, so most of you know this, but just a reminder to mute your microphone if you haven't already. And before I'll start, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. All right, without further ado, effective data management and online research. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what data management is and some of the basics that data management, whether you do it in online or other research, entails, some best practices. I'm going to spend a good amount of time talking about some specific things about online research, some very hands-on tips, right? So the idea of this is not to teach you how to do research, but to kind of go to the very mechanics of how to effectively collect information, store it, organize it. I'll talk briefly about data management plans. If you don't know what those are, you will know at the end of this talks. I'll briefly talk about IRBs and data sharing, although, of course, if you want to know more about IRBs, you should talk to our colleagues there. And then I'll talk about data sharing. So data management, this is a definition by colleagues in Edinburgh, is caring for, facilitating access to, preserving, and adding value to research data throughout its life cycle. So the idea is that data that you collect, it becomes much more usable and much more valuable and much less likely to get lost if you take care and think about and manage it. So you have this idea that you care it, you nourish it, you make sure that it doesn't get hurt, but you also make sure that it grows, so to speak, so that it's well organized and that it can support your research. You preserve it, you add value, and maybe you even share it once you are done. Here are, I would say, kind of the 5 key questions that I think you should consider as you manage your data. Who does what in your project? What data are you collecting? Where are you putting the data? So how are you organizing it? How are you documenting the data? And are you going to share the data? If so, when and how? So the first thing, roles and responsibilities. So the who. If you're an early career researcher or a graduate student or an undergraduate student, you'll think, well, roles and responsibilities, it's me, and that's it. But really, even for thesis work, say, you may have collaborating faculty, so your dissertation committee, who may play a more or less active role. You may work with transcription services, be they automated or be they individuals. You may be able to get a grant to hire a research assistant. You may do research in a language that you don't speak well enough to be comfortable to work with entirely without a translator, or you may not speak the language at all. So there may be additional people involved, even in relatively small projects. And you want to think about who are those people going to be? What sorts of training do they need as they interact with the data? What sorts of access to the data do they need? So for example, the more people you give access to information, the more risk there is for that information. But also, of course, you want people to do their job effectively. And what are their roles in the project? So if you're working with a research assistant, for example, is their role to make sure that files are properly organized and named, those sorts of things. You want to be very clear and have a good sense of who is going to do what, and make sure that everyone on your team knows what is expected of them. Organization. So it's a very basic thing, but it's always where we start when we think about data management. How are you naming your files, and how are you organizing your files, right? And these are kind of your horror scenarios, but I wouldn't be surprised if at least the version on the right is something that most of us here have done in the past. I certainly have. So some very basic advice here. Set up a folder structure at the beginning of your project. Don't create folders as you need them. Think about what sorts of things you're going to collect and create the folder structure right at the beginning. Now that should be really individualized. Some projects will produce a lot of files and need more elaborate folder structures. Some projects are going to be simpler and you need fewer. It should also make sense in the context of your project. So you could, for example, have basic folders for the types of data. So say you have interviews, you have focus groups, you have archival sources, you have different surveys perhaps, or if you do quantitative research, you may have a folder for data, you may have a folder for code, you may have a folder for documentation, whatever works in the context of your research, but set it up beforehand and stick to it and agree on it with your collaborators if they are. Do come up with a file naming convention. It will make your life easier to find things, to sort things, to know what to look for if you can't find that one file that was really important. Again, there is no right or wrong here. But a typical way to do this is something like the data type, maybe a short title, and then the date. So something like interview, and then maybe the interview code. So I made up I-23 here, and then the date. And we recommend you write this date in what's referred to as the ISO format, so year, month, day. The advantage of that is that if you happen to have the same file for some reason twice, your computer knows how to sort ISO dates, right? Because they sort alphabetically or numerically in the right order automatically. If you do have a project with a lot of complicated files, do consider organizing apps. There is different tools, and try out what you like, seek out recommendations. Some things that I like. Tropy is an open source app that's dedicated to organizing images taken in archives. Unfortunately, perhaps not the most useful thing for online research, but it can be used. Zotero is something that I use a lot. It's great for academic literature, but also for generic web sources. There are general note organization apps, DevonThink, Evernote. I meant to include here, if you do quantitative work, I would strongly recommend that you use a version control system, particularly GitHub. It makes managing code and data much easier, and easier kind of to track down what you did and when. All right, So I promised I would talk some about online data. So one of the things that we've done a fair amount in our research projects, and I would assume a lot of you who do qualitative work have done a fair amount of, our interviews. Some general advice here. This may be obvious, but do test your setup, both in terms of, does your microphone work? Can you hear people, etc. But you've probably been on enough calls that that's the case, but also test that the recording works and it works the way you imagine it, you know where to look for it, etc. Some of you will have recorded dozens of calls already, that's no problem, but for a lot of us, recording calls isn't something that we typically do. Next step, something that not super unique to online research, but I wanted to bring it up. If you start out interviewing, I would encourage you to do more preparation for interviews than you might think. So one thing that I've started doing in my research, and that I've actually learned from a collaborator, is that we have a generic interview protocol for semi-structured interviews, but we actually rewrite this slightly for every interviewee to have specific cues and specific questions. That allows us to signal to the interviewee that we came in prepared and that we know who we're talking to. That's especially true if you're talking to experts or elites. It also allows you to get the best information because people don't spend the valuable time in the interview repeating stuff that you could have just read up on before the interview. And then most of you will probably want to record interviews. It's very convenient. But you do want to ask permission depending on what you're interviewing on. It might make people uncomfortable. And in most scenarios, it makes sense to add an opt-in or opt-out option, maybe even as part of your informed consent or at the beginning of the call. Right? Recordings are great to have, but if that comes at the cost of making your participants uncomfortable, it's not worth it. Specifically, Zoom interviews, which is what I assume most of you will be doing, and certainly what we've mostly been doing. Be aware you can record Zoom calls both to the cloud and locally. With the local option is available for free Zoom accounts, but since we have a Zoom through Syracuse University, you have both available to you. The settings, perhaps slightly unintuitively, are actually online in your profile settings. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Zoom can actually transcribe meetings for you, but that's not enabled by default. So that's where you would have to go to that profile settings. That's only true for cloud recordings. And it pulls out, it gives out transcripts in a format that's called VTT. That's the same format that, say, YouTube uses for subtitles. So it is very nice if you want to do something like this and subtitle a webinar. What Zoom produces is likely going to be better than YouTube's auto subtitles. But if you just want a transcript for your own use, say to analyze it in some software or to read through it, you can also find converters and conversion scripts online if you just Google VTT to text or something like that. That will turn that VTT format, which has a lot of like timestampy stuff and is kind of awkward to read, into a nice and readable text file. Now, mind you, these are automated transcripts, so they are only so good, and it varies a lot how good they are. It depends on who is talking, the sound quality, etc. So like most of those automated services, they struggle with people with accents. The stronger the accents, the more the the app struggles, those sorts of things. So it will vary a lot. It almost always requires some cleanup, but it's great to have. And in my experience, it's still faster to clean up an automated transcript than to transcribe by hand. Though note that there are traditions of at least qualitative research that think that transcription itself is an analytic act and shouldn't be automated. So, know what you're doing and what's appropriate within the particular framework that you're working on. Another note on the cloud recordings, they get stored online, which is great. You have another recording, but Syracuse has set this up to be have them deleted after 4 months. So good practice would be to download them as soon as they become available. They don't become available right after the interview, so don't panic if they don't appear right away. If you talk for an hour, which is, if you have a 1 hour interview, it will typically appear 2-3 hours later, but varies slightly depending on how busy the Zoom servers are. Now, Zoom says that all Zoom meetings are encrypted, but there are some concerns about security, and it's not designed with kind of security in mind. So if you have particularly sensitive conversations, consider secure messaging apps, especially if you're talking to people who are already used to using such apps. The principal app in this space is Signal. It exists for PCs, I think Macs, definitely on Android and iOS. Works just like any other of the many such apps now, but it's optimized for security with some downsides in terms of usability and storing information, but it's great if you want to have these sensitive conversations. In terms of encryption, WhatsApp, which is probably the most common such app, is just as good, but it shares a lot of contact information around, particularly with the Facebook company. So there are some limitations to that. You can record when you're using those apps. There are apps for your phone that are just kind of voice recorder over apps that work quite well. On Windows, they built in something that's called something with Xbox for recording you when you're gaming, but it actually works really well for recording calls. You can just pull that up. I think it's called the Xbox bar or something like that. 2 notes on that, obviously, especially because that might not be as obvious to your participants. It's absolutely essential that you be transparent about this. As a researcher, I don't think there's ever a scenario where you can secretly record a call that you make as part of your research. And also consider that making a recording of a highly sensitive conversation does add one more risk factor. It's typically fine, but there are certainly scenarios, say if you're talking with, say, political dissidents or so, where you may want to consider being even more careful and just taking notes or something along those lines. The next thing that I would assume a lot of us are doing more of is scouring the internet for information. And stuff on the internet disappears all the time. And I assume you're aware of this. One thing that I like to cite is this 2013 study done by three researchers at Harvard Law, who found that 50% of links in decisions by the Supreme Court were actually broken at that point in time. So that's bad, right? It's bad for your research because you can't actually easily come back to that page, but it's even worse for other people reading your research, right? You want to put that link in your article, and then people click it, and they can't actually see what you were writing about. Let me see how easily I can switch to a browser. So there's two things that you can do about this. One thing is to just use, let's say I'm doing research on telecommunications in Tanzania. The Citizen is Tanzania's largest paper. I don't actually know how reliable those links are, but kind of once you move beyond the largest newspapers in the world, even for newspapers, I would assume links are fragile. So if I want to store locally, there's a bunch of apps that I can use. Some of you may recognize this is included in Zotero. So Zotero finds a little bit of metadata for this item here. And then if you click that button, it saves not just the article, but it does this thing, that includes a snapshot there. The second thing, and the snapshot is essentially a full copy of that article that you can use locally. There is, if you don't want to deal with Zotero, there is the same thing. It's an app called Single File. It's a free add-on available for most browsers, I think, that uses exactly the same technology actually, and stores that web page in a way that's easily accessible. It's also a single file. If you've ever just saved the web page, you'll notice it saves one file and then it saves a folder, and you kind of have to keep track of moving them together, and it doesn't always work terribly well. So that's a bit of a mess. But now that gives you the file locally, but that obviously doesn't help to ensure that other people have access to that file when they're reading your research. And for that, I recommend the magical word that is the Wayback Machine. The Wayback Machine has two uses in online research. One thing is that, as the title suggests, you can actually go back in time. And so if we do something like go to the, look at, I think that's the right URL, look at the Maxwell homepage. It pulls up a calendar, takes a while. And right, so those black bars are how often it saved the page in various years. And so I can go, let's go as close to as possible 20 years back in time. So that would be February 26. And so I can look at how the Maxwell School looked at 20 years ago. I didn't actually do this in preparing for this talk. So you see, especially earlier on, there were some, shall we say, problems with reliability. Some of these things didn't apparently quite save properly, so you have all these broken images. But you can see our motto. You can follow, you can see what they link to. So some of this still exists. The newer snapshots are better. This has two obvious uses, right? One is if a page went dark entirely, if it's in the Wayback Machine, and a lot of the internet is, you can still find it. The other thing is to do what we're doing right now and kind of get a cross-time snapshot. So let's look September, February 2010. So right, we can kind of have some fun surfing through time and look at it. This looks like it's March 2010. You see the capture is better. The web layout is slightly more modern, still very 2010, but you get the idea. All right, now the Wayback Machine does something that's called crawling the web. So it automatically tries to capture web pages. And you see for something like the Maxwell School, it does that all the time. So you can rely on it. If you if you go on websites that have much less traffic and are then also much more likely to go away, there's a good chance the Internet Archive won't automatically find them or won't automatically find them in time. And so what you can do then is you have two options. One is you install a little add-on again for your browser by the Internet Archive. It's called Wayback Machine. You click it and you click on Save Page Now. And then it takes an archived copy right now of the page that I'm currently looking at. And it takes a little bit of time and sometimes it fails. So it's good that it tells me this, but most of the time it will work, but some web pages specifically object to being archived. And I assume that's the case for the citizen here. The other way in which you can do the same thing, but it will also fail, is you copy the URL and then you go to the Wayback Machine homepage, and there is a Save Page Now field here. So if you don't want to install the add-on, or you just have a couple of links that you want to make sure are archived, you can just put it in here and click on Save Page. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to show about this. Strongly recommended to do for essentially any source that you save as part of your research. There's no cost for you, and you make sure that there is a record of what you consulted in the course of your research. Now, there are two ways of automating this that I wanted to point you to. One is a tool that we at QDR developed that's called Archiver. This is written in R, so if you've never used R, that may not be for you, although it's not terribly difficult to use for beginners. But what that does is it takes a whole list of URLs and asks the Internet Archive to archive them. You can either just give it a table, but you can even give it a Word document, and it will identify all the URLs in a Word document. So you've written a bibliography maybe and want to make sure everything in there is archived. And it will automatically do that and return back a table with the original link and then the link to that file in the Internet Archive. The other thing that's also really cool is if you do that Zotero thing, there's actually an add-on that automatically creates an archived copy of every URL that you save in Zotero. And that would be something that you install as an add-on to Zotero. And then again, you have made sure that there's always an archived version. This third online topic I wanted to talk about is finding digital data, right? Now that we can't as easily go, say, to the archive, so go collect data ourselves, relying on digital data available elsewhere is particularly useful, and we need to get better at it. But it's also, even once we can travel again, it's a great way to do, if you want, low-cost fieldwork because you don't have to travel. It's a great way to get prepared for fieldwork because you consult materials before you get somewhere. And so it's a useful skill whether there are pandemic-related travel restrictions or not. That website that was put together by one of my collaborators at Georgetown and her colleagues, Diana Kapyczewski, has a wealth of resources on this. They have a lot of different archives of digitized information, historical and otherwise, but they also have advice, guidance. They're building that site. It's fairly new, so they'll be adding content, and it's strongly recommended. I also want to point out that your librarians, specifically your subjects librarians, tend to be experts in finding digital information if it exists. So if you do research on a specific topic, either substantively or geographically, find your subject librarian, schedule research consultation, and see if they can help you find something. They're incredibly knowledgeable about this. And they also know special licensed paid holdings that Syracuse University holds that often are very expensive, but also often really, really cool and just have an incredible wealth of information. If you want to analyze data that isn't just kind of digitized collections, but stuff that people have already organized and compiled for research, there's a wealth of data repositories. You'll likely be familiar with some of them. ICPSR is the big archive for quantitative data, mainly at Michigan University. The Roper Center is the largest collection of public opinion surveys. The Harvard Dataverse is a huge archive of data that researchers from various projects have archived themselves. If you're interested in qualitative data, the UK Data Archive has been archiving qualitative data since the mid-90s. I think there are now around 1,200 or so archived qualitative studies, so it's a huge collection. At QDR, we are at about 100, so much smaller, but it's also growing and really interesting collection. So you may be able to find something there. The last thing that I wanted to point out is that obviously I'm not the first person to talk to that. In fact, researchers from a lot of different disciplines and geographic interests have been talking about this for the last 9-10 months. We had a great series of panels as part of the Method Summer Institute that we typically have here at Syracuse every summer, IQMR, that I link to here. And those are some leading experts in different traditions of doing research with some of what they learned and their advice for doing digital fieldwork. And it's warmly recommended, but that's just one of many resources. As I started looking around on that, I found, historians have been thinking hard about how do we replace archives. Ethnographers have been thinking very hard about how can we do digital ethnography. So you can find a lot more if you search around a bit. All right, back to data management standards, if you want. One of the things that is often underrated and underdone in data management is documentation. Documentation is incredibly important in the long term. As you work on longer projects, you often don't remember as well as you think now you will remember things that you started doing at the beginning, right? And so if you just have a one-year research project, you probably will remember, but dissertations may take 3-5 years to finish, and then once until the time it's a book may have been 10 years from when you started. And so writing down things that you think you will never forget is going to be incredibly important for you to use that information in the long term. So don't skimp on that. It also helps others to better understand your data. That's great if you think about research transparency, reusable research, those types of topics. But it's also great as you extend your project, and I've been working a lot more with research assistants and having well-documented data and processes will help them. It will save you time because you can point them at documents. It will also help them do a better job because they don't have to capture my semi-stream of consciousness rambling about my research project, but have my nicely structured and written documentation about what I done, why I did it, what happened when, all those sorts of things that they can rely on, and that makes their jobs in coming onto a new project much easier, and by that also makes your own research better. As you are sharing information with others, good documentation also helps you to avoid other people misusing or misunderstanding your data. And if you want to share your data, it helps us to share the data in a way that it's better understandable and more easily findable by other researchers, which is crucial because you want your data to be found so that it is used and ideally cited. As you think about documenting your data, your guiding question should be, if I were to come to this data the first time, if I were that reuser, or if I were that graduate student, what would I want to know to make sense of it? And some pointers on what to capture and how to do that. You want to capture contextual information about the project, about the data, research site, plans, initial hypotheses, those sorts of things. Perhaps most importantly, you want to be meticulous about the methodology and processes. How did you collect, how did you sample participants? How did you recruit them? What was your interview guide? Who conducted the interviews? In what settings were interviews conducted? Same if you do survey research, right? Like, how did you compile the initial population? How were people contacted? How were people recontacted to remind them to participate in the survey? All those sorts of things. Write down your information about what sorts of files do you have that are part of your data, how are they structured. If you do quantitative research, document at the variable level, right? So have the composition of every variable. How is it measured? Is it a survey question? Is it something else documented? And that's perhaps the least obvious part, document anything about confidentiality that you may have promised for a specific piece of data, and any other access and use conditions. So for example, if you use licensed or proprietary data, make sure that you know how you can use them, under what condition can you share them, can you publish them, all those sorts of things. One of my principles when I think about this for my own projects and when I teach us is to keep this as simple as possible. So I use a ton of spreadsheets in kind of creating overviews and lists. And so this is something that we work with someone who was sharing data through QDR, and her project was on the 2016 presidential election and what she referred to as dehumanization. So describing your opponent or a politician in non-human terms, right? You see the horror clown there, monsters, Frankenstein, those sorts of things. And my point here is that it's very simple, right? It's just, these are a number of articles and cartoons. You just have the title, who published it, is there an author, when was it published, the original URL, and then I didn't have space here on the slide, but further down, you would then also actually see the archived URL in the Internet Archive. So those lists, you can do the same thing with interviews, and I would strongly recommend you do the interview, right? So you start with the interviewee, or in most cases, actually the key for the interviewee, and then maybe how they became part of your sample, right? Was that an original contact? Did they snowball into your sample? Did you record the interview? What was the file name of the interview? Any specific notes? If you ask them about data sharing, as we'll talk about later, did they consent to that? Set this up for your own project, but again, having these sorts of lists and keeping them updated is incredibly useful. Not just for data sharing, although it is, but really for kind of staying on top of your research, making it easy for you to find things, making it easy for you to see where you maybe need more information. Good idea is also to have some documentation in the files themselves. So for example, if you do interviews, have a consistent way in which you mark question and answers, maybe have a brief header in which you describe what one might call metadata, so who interviewed, when, is there any relevant context? If you work in statistical software, make sure that variable attributes are well documented, so have variable labels there, have your missing data clearly labeled, those sorts of things. If you do use Excel, be a little careful with quantitative data in Excel. Excel has a lot of opinions about what things are suddenly dates and messes up data. But if you are going to use it, again, keep it well organized, use the document properties to make the file easily findable, use clear worksheet labels like we did here. When you're using multiple worksheets, don't just have sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3. That's terrible. So just to kind of give you a sense, if for a transcript, this is data that we have on QDR. These are on the record interviews, so you have the real name of the both the interviewee and the interviewer in the first line. Then you have what they are, the location and the time of the interview, and then you have the interview question in bold and the answer in regular font. So again, nothing complicated, but good to have this and good to have it in a uniform format throughout your project. Briefly want to talk about worst case scenarios for your data, right? You can lose your data in various ways. The left option is currently less likely. The right option is the more common one anyway and hasn't gotten any less likely. In particular, if you're spending less time maybe on computers at Maxwell, which are automatically updated, your personal computers may not have the same luxury, so you want to be particularly thorough with backups. For longer projects, stuff always happens. All sorts of things, right? Like just a plain hard disk crash, human error, coffee that your cat throws over your keyboard, all sorts of options. The basic rule for backups is quite simple. You want a minimum of 3 versions of every important file, and you want it in 2 locations. The 2 locations, right, if something physical happens, say your house gets broken into or so, someone steals your laptop and your external hard disk, you don't want those to be your 2 only copies of a file. And you want your backups to happen regular, automatically, and incremental. By that, I mean, they need to happen at least once a day. They must not rely on you remembering to press a button, because things will break on that day where you forgot to press a button. So have that set up in a way that it happens automatically. And ideally, they should be incremental. Incremental is this idea that you can go back kind of to individual files in time, the way that originally kind of that was the Mac time machine thing that it was famous for, but by now you can set that up for any type of computer. Dropbox does it too. Importantly, occasionally, and I don't mean every month, but maybe every half year or once you set it up or so, make sure that your backups actually work. There's a fantastic video that you can look up on about Pixar almost losing, I think, Toy Story 2 because their backups didn't work and someone made a mistake and deleted files, and then neither the original nor the backup was there, and they found one copy on someone's work from home computer, but check that your backups work. One great way to back up files is, in fact, cloud storage, right? The nice thing about placing a file in Dropbox is that it's regular, automatic, incremental, and also already gives you, right, 2 versions in 2 locations, even if you don't have any 2 machines synced with Dropbox. So it's really, really nice. But you do need to be somewhat careful with sensitive data. There are university rules about what sorts of data you can and cannot store on cloud services. There are also different levels of good for for sensitive data. So Google Drive is not particularly privacy respecting, whereas OneDrive and Dropbox are a little bit better. Good idea to talk to IT if you're uncertain. If you have really sensitive data, the Maxwell IT team is really helpful. We have protected, secured virtual drives that you can get access to, and they're really, really helpful. And so if you have needs there, I can only recommend that you go talk to them, or rather email to set up a virtual call in most cases, I suppose. I also briefly want to talk about IT security. Attacks, software attacks or computer attacks have increased during COVID-19 because more people are working from home, so more things are exposed to attackers, which means that even if your work isn't sensitive in any way, you do need to have basic IT security in place, or bad things will happen. Viruses, ransomware, etc. If you do have highly sensitive context, there may be additional things that you should or even must do, but I kind of want to focus on the basics here. One is identifying information separately from data, right? So the standard scenario there is if you have interviewees, you assign them pseudonyms, and then you have a re-identification key in case you do need to recontact them, but that re-identification key shouldn't just be stored in the same folder as your data list, because that's pointless. You should have it in an entirely different place, and you probably want to have separate encryption on there because you don't need that file all that often. The two other things are standard security tips, but can't be overstated in how effective they are. One is use a password manager. One of the principal ways in which accounts are hacked are we can only remember so many passwords, so you will reuse your password, or you will use passwords that are too simple. And people, one database of passwords gets hacked that includes one of your username password combination. They try this on all other sites and find one where you've repeated the same password. Password manager automatically gives you a different complex password for every site that you use. It's also very convenient to use. Good password managers now work really nicely on both mobile and desktop devices and sync your passwords. You can use kind of a third-party app. I use Dashlane. If you're kind of an Apple person, the built-in kind of iOS syncing option is really good too. So there are various options that you can use there. The third thing is perhaps the most important one in terms of security is to use multi-factor authentication whenever that's available. So I think we actually recently got an email from SU encouraging us to use the two-factor authentication provided by Microsoft. If you haven't done that, please do it. Protect your NetID. But you can do that for a lot of important services, for Dropbox, for all the Google apps, for GitHub if you use it, etc. Depending on your needs, there are different ways to do this. The most secure way is what's called a FIDO key. That's a little USB stick that looks kind of like this. And that needs to be physically in the computer where you're trying to log in. That's unphishable because, right, you actually need to have the physical device with you as you log in. So someone who tries to remotely impersonate you literally cannot do that. The downside, biggest downside there is that it might not work on Syracuse or on Maxwell computers. I haven't gotten in to test it, but Stan warned me that that might be a problem, so be aware of that. Google, for example, sells these in these nice 2-packs. So you have kind of a backup if you lose one key, and one of them also comes with Bluetooth, so works kind of nicely with your phone, but you can find them from a lot of other companies if you don't want to buy from Google, so this is not advertisement. The second option are authenticator apps like the Microsoft Authenticator app that SU uses, Google has one. There's an independent one. Essentially, what they do is they sync once with the site that you that you want to secure, and then it displays a unique 6-number code that you put in. And again, it's fairly safe, but it could theoretically be intercepted by someone who's targeting you specifically, so it's slightly less safe. Text messages were the original multi-factor authentication. They're a good bit less safe because phone numbers can be spoofed, all those sorts of things, but they're still much, 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 much better than not having multi-factor authentication in place at all. So if text messages is what you want to use, please at least use that. If you're working with more sensitive information, please consult with professionals. All right. Data management plans are essentially a write-up of all the things that we discussed that you create at the beginning of your research project. You often need to do this now for grants. NSF requires it, for example, and NIH will soon require it. We have a checklist specifically for qualitative data management plans at QDR. There's also a really useful app called the MP tool that guides you through the process of writing one. As I said, you have to do this if you apply for NSF funding. I would strongly encourage you to do this for any larger research project that you start. Last topic that I briefly want to talk about is data sharing. It's increasingly expected for all empirical research. It was expected by funders. It's increasingly expected by journals and by your peers who will expect you to work transparently. It's not a binary choice. There, I didn't finish my sentence. You can share part of your data that's perhaps more easily shareable than other parts of your data if that's the only option that you have for copyright or human participants reason. You should think about what you want to share from the start because it impacts how you store it, what sorts of permissions you ask. If you want to work with a data repository, you should consult with them. You should think about how you document stuff so that it's sharing. You should think about talking to your participants about that you will share data with other researchers. And especially if you plan to share a lot of data, you should budget for it. Note that that might get you into conflict. If you tell your IRB, say that you'll destroy all data or you won't share your data with anyone, and then you write in your DMP, your data management plan, that you will share data and then give it to the NSF, you're kind of in hot water because you essentially promised the federal agency that you're going to share your data and promised the board authorized by federal law that you won't. So make sure that your data management plan and what you write into your IRB align. And there's a fair amount of overlap between both applications. So think of them in tandem. I wanted to quickly throw this out there as kind of an example of how you could ask for this. This is from a study of two collaborators who working on a fairly sensitive topic, actually. So they're interviewing people about abortions and how they kind of think about them. And what they did, they didn't want people to stop talking to them because they asked for data sharing. So they had an optional additional consent. So you consent into the study, and then they asked, do you agree? Do you agree to allow a written copy of your interview to be shared with other researchers in the future? And that was a separate copy, and it also said that you can still be in the study whether you agree to data sharing or not. And they specify kind of in simple terms how this will be de-identified, right? We will take out or change any information that can identify you before sharing. So very simple language, but very clear and kind of maintains that important idea of respect for persons that is crucial for ethical research, that you make clear to people what you're going to do with information that you get by talking to them, say. Remember, you have a lot of help in all of these processes. You have IRB, you have a great IT department. You may work with partner organizations that have their own expectations, but also their own expertise. You have a data repository that you can talk to. Perhaps you have an excellent data services here as you. So there's lots of places that can and should help you. If you want to share data, it's a bunch of options. There are kind of generalist repositories where you can typically just go and put up your data, press a button, and it's immediately published. And then there is disciplinary repositories like QDR or like ICPSR that will help, that will provide more services, give you more advice, curate your data, but there's typically some sort of cost involved either for the person depositing the data or downloading the data. Although one of the way we do this as QDR is with membership agreements, so it's typically free for you as an SU researcher. I'll skip over access controls and just ask you to please stay in touch with us as QDR if you have any questions, particularly about sharing, archiving, managing qualitative data. And hope that was useful. And we only have about 5 minutes left for questions, but I'm happy to stay a little over time if there are more. All right. You can put questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just talk. I will talk about controlled access. That's one of the ways if you have sensitive data, if you do want to share them, one of the things to remember is that, again, it's not binary, not just in terms of not sharing anything, but you can also share data under different conditions. You can share data with the condition that it's only available in X amount of time. You can have researchers apply to access data. You can request specific access modalities, so they can only access them with us through specific secure connection or even in a specific safe room. So depending on the nature of the data and how sensitive it is, there are a lot of ways to make even quite sensitive data available to qualified researchers in a safe way or at a safe time. So just as you keep that in mind as you think about, can I share my data? All right, now we got questions. The presentation, the slides will get shared. So that's easy. We'll email them to all participants. And Kate is asking, you mentioned interview tags. Is there a way of filing those separately, or do you just find them in the transcript or the recording? If you get a Zoom download that actually, because it knows the names of all the participants, it has the speaker tags automatically, and then you might want to make sure you want to make sure that you can keep yours. But typically, if you want to de-identify, you want to remove the one of your of the person you're talking to, or replace it with their pseudonym. But otherwise, the recommendation would be to keep them in the interview text so that you can kind of see who is talking when. I think that was, yeah, okay, that apparently answered the question. All right. Oops, didn't want to do that.
Hi, Chris. Sebastian, sorry. Just a quick question. So all the sources and links you were referring to, I take it they're available free. There's no subscription or need to pay anything to access them.
I think most of my links are free. They're all free for Syracuse University. Some of them might be licensed, but I think most of them are just free. Yes.
Okay.
So yes, general just free. If not free, then licensed through Syracuse University. So as a Syracuse affiliated student or researcher, you would have access to them, but most of them are just free. Some of the digital databases are paid for by the university, so that would be the non-free part.
Okay, thank you.
Right, so if you, confidentiality, and I'll take this as the last question, confidentiality and including the name of the interviewee, absolutely don't do this if you promise confidentiality. What you would do in that case is you have a list where you map the names of your participants to a pseudonym. That list, as I mentioned earlier, you keep separate and you encrypt, and your interview would be named with the pseudonym, and the name at the top of the file would again just carry the pseudonym. So never store information that's unnecessarily identifiable with the data themselves. The case that I had in the data here was an on-the-record interview, so that was not a concern there. That's, and a lot of the times, that's not going to be the case for you. All right. Be in touch if you have any follow-up questions. Nice talking to you all, and have a great afternoon. Thanks again, Morgan and Yuri.
Thank you.
Thank you.